From the 17th century to the present day, laissez-faire economists have treated people in different social classes as endowed with different human natures. Again, I want to point out, not just in political theory, but in economic theory, it comes across even more staggeringly. A hatred for the common people, a feeling that they're not worth much. Since they're not worth much in the bank, they're not worth much as human beings. If, after all, your value and your measurement is the cash nexus, then how much value could you possibly give to the poor? Different people of different social classes had different natures. Again, the theory of natural superiority. And therefore, they required dissimilar incentives, different kinds of incentives. For the rich to be enterprising, they must be fortified with subsidies, tax write-offs, and whatever else brings a high return on their investments. For the poor to exert themselves, they've got to have the dole and the other income support programs eliminated so they can be faced with deprivation. In other words, the rich will work if they're given money, the poor will work if they have money kept from them. As one 18th century English gentleman wrote, "Everyone but an idiot knows that the lower classes must be kept poor or they will never be industrious." It's wonderful to go back and read them in the 18th century because they're much more, they really say it then. But again, not publicly, it's just the letters to each other. The ruling class today has gotten so smart that they often don't even say that sort of thing even in private sometimes, although they do. Let's look at that natural superiority of those of substance and property. The capitalist mythology claims a natural superiority for superior means, but it doesn't say how people ever arrived at those superior means. How is the family wealth originally accumulated? What's behind these old families? There's a lovely passage in Adam Smith's Wealth of the Nation where he talks about old families. And he says, what do we mean by old families? Surely the pauper and the prince both have an ancient lineage. They both go back. You go as far back as Rockefeller does too, unless you want to claim you're a fourth generation mutation or something that just came. We all come from old families. So Smith says, I know what they mean when they say old families. They mean families where the money has been there a while. It's old money. Well, if you look in the lineage of almost every old family, there can be found a plunderer, a swindler, or a freebooter, whose ill-gotten gains became the family inheritance. Nelson Aldrich Jr. wrote, not too long ago, he noted the dubious but not unique achievements of his own great-grandfather, Nelson Aldrich Sr. Back in 1880, the son of a mill hand who entered the U.S. Senate with very modest assets, he received an annual salary of only $5,000 a year. Yet, after 30 years in politics, he died with $12 million. And if one looks into the genealogies of many old families, one discovers episodes of slave trafficking, rum smuggling, gun running, land grabs, violent acquisitions of water and mineral rights, opium trading. The Delanos were opium traders. I only found that out the other night. I was watching this thing, a documentary on China, and I've been reading about the opium trade in China and the opium wars, and they said, Delano. Old man Delano was making millions on the opium trade. That's a New York aristocratic family. You've heard of them, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The slaughter of indigenous peoples, falsified deed claims, sales of shoddy and unsafe goods, protection rackets, public funds used for private speculations, crooked deals in government bonds and vouchers, government giveaways, and payoffs for political favors. One will find in the old families fortunes that are built on slave labor, indentured labor, prison labor, immigrant labor, women's labor, child labor, and scab labor, all backed by the lethal force of gun thugs and assassins and militia and army. Old money, my friends, old money is often little more than dirty money that's been laundered by several generations of possession. In the modern era of popular elections, political leaders have learned to deny the existence of class warfare and class differences, even as they engaged in it from the top down. During the labor agitations of the late 19th century, Senator Roscoe Conkling denounced, quote, the most dangerous of the country's enemies, those who maintain that a conflict exists between the two great partners, capital and labor. He and other politicos sought to distract and dilute working class militancy with a whole set of what historian Matthew Jacobson called the most ingenious tactics of ideology. They played upon racial, linguistic, regional, and religious differences and old country loyalties in order to work against the groundswell of class interest. They sought thereby to divide and to neutralize sections of the working population, thereby displaying, Josephson goes on, quote, an unusual awareness rather than indifference to underlying economic issues and class forces. It wasn't that they didn't know about classes, that they didn't want you to know about classes and differences. Class-conscious plutocrats are the first to condemn class consciousness when it emerges among the general populace. In 1935, press mogul William Randolph Hearst denounced the Wagner Act, which was designed to protect labor's rights to organize, as, quote, one of the most vicious pieces of class legislation that could be conceived, un-American to the core. By the way, most legislation is class legislation, favoring the haves at the expense of the have-nots, especially the laws that safeguard corporate prerogatives and subsidize upper-class income and investments. It's only those rare policies that favor the many against the few that are singled out as divisive and even unpatriotic. In 1989 presidential campaign and the 1992 campaign, George Bush both times denounced class warfare. He talked about the attempts to revoke tax laws that benefited the rich as class warfare. There is no place in American public life, he said, for the kind of talk that divides Americans along class lines. So here's an upper-class warrior, you see. For him, policies that shifted the tax burden onto the shoulders of the working populace were not class warfare, only policies that sought to undo such favoritism. Another upper-class warrior, Pope John Paul II, I call him the CIA Pope, that most political of all popes, denounced efforts by liberation theologians to mobilize the poor and, quote, see the poor as a class in struggle or as separate from pastoral obedience. So the poor should not be thinking of themselves as a class. If they're not a class, what are they? The poor. What do you mean by the poor? The Pope did not define the continually successful pursuit of power and privilege by the rich as part of class warfare. Top-down class warfare is never noticed. It's only when people begin to mobilize and fight back.